So the talk title today is The Boundary Dilemma. And the dilemma, when I was thinking of boundaries, and that was the general topic for the week, I was kind of always had this idea about boundaries. It's like, well, we don't really want to put up hard boundaries. Sometimes we need to, but in general, on our spiritual path, we kind of want to have maybe boundaries that allow us some freedom. And yet, so often, we tend to kind of restrict ourselves through boundaries. And so I was going to look at that this morning, kind of this dilemma of how do we navigate the world of boundaries, and maybe do we even need them? I mean, is there something beyond the idea of needing boundaries? The other thing that came to mind was thinking about boundaries was I had a friend named Pat, and they used to work for Google Maps years ago, but apparently they were terrible at drawing the boundaries between countries. And when Pat was let go, they were basically told they were borderline incompetent. Yeah, that was a pretty brutal joke, but someone's got to say it, so I did. But we're going to explore this idea of boundaries. And the first thing is that there's these boundaries that are known as restrictive boundaries. They tend to be very firm or hard boundaries. They hinder our growth. They really keep us from realizing our potential as these beautiful expressions of one life. They're often self-imposed, or they could also be imposed by societal rules or norms, but belief systems that tend to limit us, but we want to, or we feel we need to stay on the path of this restriction. But they can lead to negative thought patterns and really hold us back. Some common examples are suppressing emotions. Many of us may have been brought up with the idea that it's not safe or it's not correct, or even both, to express our emotions, such as sadness or anger or joy. Sometimes this can be out of the fear of being rejected by others. If I really open up and say what's going on, then I may not be accepted, or I could be shunned. And so we restrict ourselves in that way. We can set up overly rigid boundaries, such as never letting anyone into our lives or even our homes, and then we can end up with a sense of isolation or loneliness that is hard to overcome. But again, it can be being driven by an idea of a very restrictive boundary. Another example of how this plays out on our spiritual path or life in general, for even those that aren't aware that they're spiritual beings in human form, a person may have the belief that I'm not worthy of abundance. I'm not good enough. And so this is operating within a restrictive boundary in this area of worthiness or abundance. And so it's really challenging for such an individual, even with the support of a minister or practitioner. It can still be very challenging because that root belief is that they're not worthy. It's going to be really hard to manifest good health and prosperity and have a sense of joy or happiness on a regular basis. And this ties right into that first aspect of consciousness growth. And just real quick, if you haven't been exposed to the aspects of consciousness, I'll just do a real quick run through. So there's 4 aspects. The first aspect is the powerless victim mentality. And it's the idea that life is happening to me. I can't really influence anything in my life. I just suffer and take it as it comes. The second aspect I refer to as the director. It's by me. It's where I'm manifesting change. Maybe I'm using spiritual principles. I'm aware of them, starting to change my life. Then there's the partner, which is the through me energy, where I have a sense of partnership, of co-creating with spirit or God, life, whatever word we choose to use to describe the infinite divine presence. And the last is that presence, which is the as me aspect of consciousness. Now, it's important to know and understand that we're always the fourth. We're always the as me. There's no true reality where we're not expressing as the one life, or we're all aspects of it. We're all unique expressions of the one life. But our own thoughts, our belief system, our emotions, our feelings, our life experience often pulls us out of of that truth, and we end up living life through one of these other aspects. But if we're looking at strictly these restrictive boundaries, they really equate to and hold us in that powerless state because we don't feel we can do anything outside those boundaries. And we may have restrictive boundaries in one area of our life and maybe not in another, but in that area where they're restrictive, we have a sense of very little power. And yet, science of mind tells us, what I like to refer to as the promise of science of mind, is that the principle of life is more powerful than anything in our past, any experience, any belief we may have. And so we are always free, whether we realize it or not, to change some of these boundaries, to manifest something different in our life. In fact, the science of mind teaching really encourages us to identify and challenge these types of limiting beliefs or boundaries. And we can do this through affirmations, visualization, meditation, of course, taking classes in the support of a practitioner, a spiritual guidance session. There's a number of ways that we can help to start to dissolve the false beliefs, take down these restrictive barriers, and start to live life in a different way. You know, Ernest Holmes really did emphasize that by understanding spiritual law and changing our thinking, we break free of limitations, and that would certainly include a limited belief that believes in a restrictive boundary. In The Science of Mind on page 32, Dr. Holmes wrote, "It has been written that the truth shall make us free, provided we know the truth, and we note that the evolution of consciousness brings with it the acquisition of new powers and higher possibility." So again, as we're on this path and we're learning, we're not changing life at all. We're just becoming more aware of the truth that's always present, the truth that there is a creative principle. There is a law that takes the imprints of our thoughts, our core beliefs, and brings that forward, manifesting into this world of form that we live in. And, you know, my personal take on these restrictive boundaries is they're really mental and emotional barriers that are born out of attachment, ignorance, and really the illusion and the belief in a separate ego. Now, what do I mean by that when I say separate ego? It's the idea that there's a me who's all alone, and it's just a thought form. It's not a reality, obviously, but there's a me who's all alone and separate from life, and that I have to kind of go on my own, and I have to figure it out, and that can lead to a lot of fear and anxiety and uncertainty, and even maybe putting restrictive barriers on myself so that I just don't take chances because I don't know if things are going to work out. And ultimately, it's keeping us trapped in what some other teachings would refer to as suffering. It's the mental, emotional suffering that comes from living a life of false beliefs. But as we grow in our understanding of spiritual truth, and once we start, it's really hard to stop. The growth continues regardless of, even as you move through these aspects, and you're maybe predominantly living in aspect 3 or even 4, the growth and the understanding, the expansion doesn't stop. Life is infinite. Life is growing. Life knows no boundaries. But as we grow in our spiritual understanding, experience positive change in our lives, of course, this begins a process. It's really a circular process of, as we manifest change, we start to believe more in the principles. And as we believe more in the principles, we can continue to manifest greater change in our lives. And we start to experience a different type of boundary, or start to work with a different type of boundary, which is the generative, Generative, generative boundaries. Now, these boundaries we consciously choose, so we're not asleep or feeling powerless. Sometimes those restrictive boundaries just kind of come out of behaviors or a belief that's even unconscious. But here we're consciously choosing limits that foster growth, creativity, and well-being. That may seem a little bit like an oxymoron, that I'm choosing a boundary that fosters growth. But as I go forward here over the next few minutes, hopefully it'll start to make sense and bring some more light upon that idea. But they're not about restriction. These generative boundaries are about creating a safe and structured space for transformation. And they tend to be pliable, protective, yet not restrictive, or changeless. So a generative boundary is something that, as we expand in our spiritual understanding of life, does tend to move and allow for change and allow for growth, and it can be tweaked. Now, an example that we all have in our lives is our skin. Our skin is a living boundary. It protects us from harm, keeps our inside safe, holds everything together. And yet it's not totally restrictive, and it breathes, it sweats, it heals. And it's not armor, it's not restrictive like strong armor that holds everything in and keeps everything out, but it's dynamic. It's a responsive barrier to the conditions that are going on. You know, when we're hurt, we get a cut. The skin closes up, repairs itself. And when we're hot, it opens to release heat. So it's very pliable, you know, and generative. It's not restrictive. It's something that it is a boundary, but it kind of moves and changes as needed. And like skin, our boundary should protect us, but also allow for connection and healing and change in our lives. And looking back at the aspects of consciousness idea, this would be the aspect of the director, where the director is coming out of that powerless state, realizing that these overly restrictive boundaries are hindering personal growth and spiritual awareness and understanding. So we begin to set healthy boundaries as we're manifesting change. And so we're starting to change our understanding, change our belief about life. And Ernest Holmes reminds us on page 322 of Science of Mind that life is a mirror, and we'll reflect back to the thinker what he thinks into it. So basically, that's the process of creation. Whatever we think into life is the experience we tend to get back. So if I tend to believe that the spiritual life is one of creativity and power and abundance and peace and love and divine expression, not only will that be what I start to notice in life, it'll be what I experience in life. And again, that wheel will continue to move forward in that way. Thus, as we're waking up from a limiting belief or a limiting understanding, moving away from those restrictive barriers, we will more easily manifest this positive change we're looking for. And we naturally, over time, as we start to move from the director, more of the partner energy, we start to find a deeper place within our being of compassion and empathy, recognizing the divine love that is present in and through and as everything. And it really starts to shift us into this partner consciousness, which is the life happening through me. So we're more of a vessel for life. We're tending to live a separate life in our head, shutting down our heart less often. We're more open to allowing life as spirit, or have the experience of spirit moving through us, which can over time lead to an even higher state. Now, the previous two boundaries, it tend to be stages. We could have some restriction in our life where we're having mostly generative or vice versa, but they tend to act more like stages, where the aspects of consciousness are more like states. We can kind of go back and forth easily. We could be in this state of partnering with spirit, and we're creating magnificent things in our lives, and then something happens and boom, we suddenly can feel powerless and victim-like again. But as far as the boundary aspect of things, if we're living life more in that partner energy, we're going to tend not to suddenly decide when we slip into victimhood that, oh, I need to put a restrictive barrier or boundary around my life. No, we're going to remember and know this isn't the truth of who I am. And whether it's through spiritual practice or sacred conversation, we're going to move back into that state or remind ourselves of the true nature of life. So this last stage isn't a boundary. This is the boundlessness. This is no boundaries. This is the realization of our oneness with and as life itself. This is where all sense of separation and limitation dissolves. This is where we're really living life as a spiritual being, not as a spiritual ego. So as we move through these aspects of consciousness, we can get to the point where we understand a tremendous amount about how the spirit works and how life works, and really show up beautifully in the world, and yet really be still living the experience that there's a doer known as me rather than a doer known as spirit, and that I'm tending to live life as this spiritual ego rather than the boundless spirit that we all truly are. And sometimes it can sound a little woo-woo, this all sense of separation and limitation dissolves away. But it's really not. It's really just the way life is. That if we stop, unidentify, or detach from the idea that there's me who's separate, and just allow life to unfold, follow our spiritual guidance, it's a much natural, straightforward way to live. A common example I use is if you like to commune with nature, maybe you're on a hike and the sense of self falls away. You're hiking, sure, you're seeing, you're hearing, you're feeling things, but it's not me hiking, it's just the presence hiking as me, as a body, as a being. So it's maybe takes a little of that potential woo-woo out of this idea. The other thing that, another example I like to use is, and I actually stole this from the spiritual teacher, Adyashanti, got to be honest, stole it from him. But when you go to the movies, think about how when you go to the movies, and you're sitting in the movie theater, and you're watching the movie, are you sitting back kind of in a consciousness of an observer back here watching yourself watching the movie? We tend not to do that. We tend to be so engrossed in the movie that we're just living it, feeling it, being with it as one, really. Which is why following a good movie, we're in such a good mood, is that separateness, that ego, that me back here, life out there, fell away for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Or these days, with some of these longer movies, 3 or 4 hours. But it's a different experience. And so that's the idea that you can live life. It doesn't have to be trapped in a restrictive or even a generative barrier driven by an egoic mind that thinks it's separate. And so as we move deeper into this boundlessness state, we show up as, it shows up as equanimity among the challenges. The idea that we can be the calm eye in the storm that's around us. And this morning I had that storm. I had some IT challenges. The internet at the hotel I'm at was down, and then I was attempting to use my phone to provide internet service. And it was kind of working, but it was choppy. And then we switched to try to use just my phone. And then about 10 minutes before live, the internet came back up, not fully strong. So if my image has been a little choppy, that's why. But you know, the trick was to remain calm through that, because it's really hard to think, to use our mind as the tool it's supposed to be, and to maneuver any kind of challenging waters if we're not calm. The other thing that we start to have this sense of, in this boundlessness, this place beyond boundaries, is that we're really in the world, living in the world as a spiritual being, but we're not of the world or trapped in the world. So the events of the day, we don't shun them. We don't spiritual bypass what's going on in the world. But we also know that it doesn't define us or even have to define the human experience. That events are unfolding, and we know they're driven by consciousness. And so we know going forward that the vision that there's a world that works for all is really about the consciousness showing up at such a scale that then that vision is realized. You know, so it's easy to get caught up in the ways of the world, but if we just recognize that we're a spiritual being here for a period of time, we tend to move through the world in a different way, or less of a need for any kind of boundary. We can show up as the presence, live as the presence. And this thing called you, Ernest Holmes wrote, "See God in everyone, the same God with a different face, the same animating principle with a different form, the same divine presence clothed in individual expression." I'm going to read that again, and I think of this as a beautiful definition of oneness. See God in everyone, the same God with a different face, the same animating principle with a different form, the same divine presence clothed in individual expression. And when we recognize this truth, that we're all truly just expressions of the one life that's infinite, that's ever creative, that can create out of itself and yet not diminish itself, that there's no boundaries. Science tells us that the universe continues to expand. And this is also a place where paradox begins to be resolved, that we somehow have a sense that we are both the timeless emptiness and yet everything, that we're finite and yet infinite, that we can live without boundaries and yet we're totally protected. But when we live as the boundless presence, we become the walking, talking, living, praying example of possibility for others who may be living in that restricted boundary place. And so the invitation this week is to reflect on your own boundaries. Where you maybe have a restricted boundary that's very tight and very hard. And what are your generative boundaries like? Are they healthy? Are they supporting your growth? And how might you ultimately move toward the boundlessness with greater freedom and unity? Namaste.